Official death records from Greene County, Ohio, mark a man named Caesar Bowen as dying in 1888 at the recorded age of 126. The cemetery ledger lists his birth year as 1762, under the long reign of King George III, when this land was still a map of forests and rumor. Even that alone would have been enough to make men frown and file reports. What unsettles historians is something sharper. 7 notarized affidavits from well-known citizens, each swearing they had known Caesar since childhood, each insisting he had seemed ancient even then. The coroner who later examined his body noted dental wear and bone density that did not sit comfortably within any living precedent he had seen, but he stopped short of refuting the age written on the margin of the death register. For more than a century, the case was tucked away, a stubborn, shameful curiosity lodged in archives, where most scholars preferred it would remain cold. What was found in the cabin after his passing made that avoidance almost inevitable. 63 journals, bound or stitched with whatever lay to hand, written in 3 distinct hands that nevertheless bore the same voice. The book suggested a shape to Caesar's life that no comfortable explanation could hold. They suggested a man who carried more than his own years. If you are watching from Ohio, from the United States, or from any place that still keeps an eye on the shadows of its past, remember this name. These are not idle ghost stories. These are claims someone took pains to record. And what follows is the careful unspooling of that record. Greene County in the 1880s was well enough. Small prosperity stitched across rolling fields. Towns where people traded gossip with the same cadence as goods. Xenia, the county seat, had been rebuilt after the tornado of 1874. Rails threaded new faces and commerce into the place. Pride in an abolitionist past hung publicly like a banner, underground railroad routes discussed in low, reverent tones. And the war was not so distant that its echoes had stopped shaping how people moved and thought. Caesar Bowen lived 2 miles from Xenia, in a cabin the town guest had stood for at least 60 years. The logs were blackened with a century of weather. The chimney leaned as if tired of uprightness. Cedar shakes were anchored by river stones, a building habit not seen locally since the 1810s, and the house itself seemed to sag beneath some slow memory. He was a familiar shape in the village, small, barely 5 feet tall, bent under a gnarled hickory cane he said he had cut in 1799. Children, cruel in their honest hearts, sometimes mistook him for a heap of rags until he moved. His skin hung like leather left too long in the sun, furrowed in lines that read like a worn map of suffering. Yet his eyes arrested people. Pale brown, creek sand in color, unnervingly clear. They would hold a stranger until the stranger looked away. He made a living by mending. Harnesses, tools, the small things a rural life demands. His hands bowed with what folk called rheumatism, yet when he worked, they moved with an old and terrible precision. He spoke rarely. When he did, the voice scraped like dry leaves. His English retained archaisms, thee and thou, turns of phrase pulled from another century, and the silences between his words were roomy with histories. Dr. Harold Sutton of Xenia had tried for years to examine the old man properly. "The man's vitals are impossible," he told his wife at dinner in 1887. "His pulse barely 40. His breathing registers as if he were in deep sleep, yet he is fully conscious." Mrs. Sutton offered the rational consolation. Perhaps he's simply very healthy for his age. But the doctor, who read medical texts the way some men consulted scripture, could not reconcile what he saw with any precedent. The oldest verified person in the records he knew had lived to 108. If Caesar's paperwork was true, he had exceeded that by nearly 20 more years. How? That was the question no medical manual would answer. The paper traces were stubborn. Greene County kept its records with a care the weather couldn't entirely undo. There was a manumission, dated July 4th, 1826. Freed, it read, Caesar, Negro man, aged approximately 64. Freed from the service of Jeremiah Hawthorne of Virginia. The same file noted Caesar had been in the Hawthorne family since 1784, when Joseph Hawthorne's father had purchased him. An adult Negro of significant years. Work the arithmetic backward, and even the most conservative mind placed his birth in the early 1760s. But the papers were only the beginning. Caesar's own words, retold to neighbors, transcribed by a persistent reporter, copied into doctors' notes, told of a world that predates Ohio's place on any map. He spoke as if memory itself were a landscape he wandered daily. He claimed recollection of the Stamp Act riots, of Pontiac's rebellion, of winters so fierce trees split like glass, and summers where the sun turned red from fires that fed for months. He said he was born on a tobacco farm in Tidewater, Virginia, that his mother had been 16 when she bore him and died that same year of fever, that his father had been sold before he could walk. The master's name was Josiah Warren, he told the Xenia Gazette in 1885, in a rare interview that a young reporter later said filled 4 hours of notebook pages. He worked 200 acres with 23 souls. I was the smallest. They didn't think I'd live. Thomas Fletcher came to write a small human interest piece and left with pages of a life that read like a different kind of history. Caesar described the smell of drying tobacco, the striped light through cracks in the cabin walls, the songs sung in the quarters at night. Old songs rooted in Africa whose words had long been emptied of literal meaning but not of force. I remember being hungry, he said simply. Always hungry. They fed us enough to work, but never enough to be full. When Fletcher asked what stayed clearest, Caesar's answer knotted voice and memory into something dense and terrible. I remember all of it. Every face, every voice. They accumulate like stones in your chest, pressing down, making each breath an effort. The published article was clipped. The editor spared the town most of the darker lines. Fletcher kept his full notes. Those notes would later prove crucial. In the spring of 1887, the old man aged faster, or perhaps it was only that the accumulation of years revealed itself more plainly. He left town less often. On October 12th, he stopped speaking. Not slowly, not with the fading of words, but suddenly. Mid-conversation with Samuel Pritchard, a farmer who had fed him and checked in from time to time. Pritchard's later affidavit would be clear and shaken. Caesar opened his mouth, appeared to remember something that made his face shift, and then, as if remembering a debt unpaid or a horror avoided, he fell silent and pointed with strength enough to push a man away toward the door. He wanted me to leave, Pritchard said. They returned with Dr. Sutton the next morning. Caesar sat in the same chair by the fireplace, alive to touch, watching them, but mute as stone. The doctor found nothing physically wrong with throat or mouth. It is as if he has chosen not to speak, Sutton wrote. But why would a man who had endured so much elect sudden silence? Why, just when the town's curiosity might have become confession, was he refusing the simplest human act of speech? In the weeks that followed, the silence became one piece of a stranger puzzle. Caesar ate mechanically what neighbors left on his doorstep. he never left his chair. He began, Sutton recorded with an increasing unease, to lapse into episodes of temporal confusion, staring at a wall and reacting as if seeing another decade on the other side of the logs. Children whispered that his shadow fell wrong. Widows reported hearing singing inside his cabin when no one else was there. And then, on a January night in 1888, the silence broke into fever. One night in the snow, barefoot and dressed only in a nightshirt, Caesar appeared at Pritchard's door. They carried him home. For 3 days he burned as if the fire of every remembered summer had turned in upon him. In delirium, he called out names that meant nothing to the bystanders: Abigail, Jonas, Scipio, Delilah, each begging, pleading, apologizing, as if to people who would not answer. "Tell them I tried," he cried once, eyes open but fixed on a place above the ceiling. "Tell them it was never supposed to be this long." When the fever finally broke, he spoke again. A whisper at first, asking, "How many years has it been?" And then, with the slow, terrible clarity that had become his pattern, he told Dr. Sutton something the doctor could not easily dismiss. "I should have died with the others," Caesar murmured. "On the crossing, that's when it should have ended." "I never made that crossing," Caesar insisted, voice scraped thin. "I was born in Virginia. I never saw Africa, and yet I remember the hold of the ship, the smell, the chains, the rows of bodies. I remember praying in tongues I could not name. I remember men and women dying around me and never being cut loose." The confession landed in the cabin like a small stone thrown into deep water. The ripples reached every corner of Dr. Sutton's professional certainty. A rational man might have written it off as fever-broken delusion, the brain stitching together images into grotesque tapestries. Yet Sutton found himself unable to do so. The doctor had long prided himself on skepticism, on testing and repeating and measuring. Still, in that thin room with the winter wind pressing against old logs, he felt something else. The slow, undeniable tug of data that would not be explained away. Caesar's descriptions were precise in ways hallucinations rarely are. The smell of the hold, as if he could still taste it. The exact cadence of a prayer. The particular way sailors rolled corpses over to clear space. The doctor wrote everything down. News travels small towns the way a single match might set an entire barn alight. Thomas Fletcher, the young reporter who had once sat for 4 hours in Caesar's cabin, returned to Xenia in the spring of 1888. He brought with him a careful handful of letters, each folded and yellowed, each bearing a different voice from a different place. Fletcher spread them on the rickety table, and the cabin held its breath. The first was from Victoria Ashford of Richmond. Her grandfather had spoken, before his death in 1879, of a slave named Caesar who worked on their plantation in the 1780s and 90s, a man who could predict weather and seemed to know things he had no reason to know. "He spoke as if he'd read books," she wrote, and the sentence hummed with implication, some presence that did not fit the order of things. The second letter arrived from Reverend Josiah Crothers in Delaware, who described a delirious parishioner in 1850 calling out for Caesar, with the urgency of someone needing absolution. The man's daughter recalled a slave named Caesar who had run away in 1808. The father had always believed the man drowned, crossing the Potomac, and his guilt had never left him. The third letter loosened something in the room that made the wood feel colder. Dr. Edmund Thorne, a historian in Pennsylvania, wrote that he had found notarized testimony from 1823. A conductor named Ruth Ames described aiding a fugitive named Caesar, whose manner was odd. He appeared ancient, spoke with refined diction, and when asked his age, told her he felt as if he had lived 3 lifetimes, though he was 61. Miss Ames's testimony read like the outline of a riddle. Fletcher placed the letters before Caesar. The old man's hand trembled as he touched them. "I remember Victoria's grandfather," he said with the quiet of a church bell. "Thomas Ashford. He was a curious boy." He turned the page with a care that was almost a prayer. "Reverend Crowther's man, Benjamin Morton. I crossed away from his farm in 1808. The boat capsized. I remember the water taking us. I remember thinking of death as a mercy." When Fletcher asked about Ruth Ames, Caesar softened. "A saint," he murmured. "She fed me, gave me clothes. She asked my age, and I told her what felt true then. 61 years of memory. My body, though, has never matched what I remember." The 3 men around the table, the old man, the doctor, the reporter, reached a brittle consensus. Something about Caesar's life had been witnessed across decades and states, appearing in memoirs, court records, and the attestations of strangers who had no reason to collude. The implications were absurd, therefore they were dangerous. Fletcher's stack of correspondence included other things: a scattering of postcards from unknown hands, an envelope with clippings from distant newspapers, a handwritten note from an elderly woman who swore her grandmother had always whispered of a man who remembered too much. These pieces, when arranged like bones, began to form an outline of a life threaded through others' remembrances. Caesar listened, nodded, and when pressed, he offered what he had always offered in fragments: a story about a woman named Amarachi. He said she was old when she arrived at the plantation, a woman who had crossed the ocean and carried with her knowledge that did not belong to the cruel calculus of enslavement. She tended to the young and the weak. She taught of roots and herbs and rhythms of weather the white men called superstition. One night, the boy small and trembling at her feet, she performed a ceremony in the dim of the cabin. Caesar could not recite the words. His mind refused that detail as if protecting a child's fragile recollection. But he remembered her hands and the way she spoke. "You will carry the weight of your people," she told him. "You will remember what must not be forgotten." "Was it a curse?" Dr. Sutton asked, because a physician must name symptoms as either disease or deserved fate. "A blessing or a curse," Caesar said slowly. "Perhaps both. They are the same thing in different light." He described without theatricality the changes that followed. Wounds that closed where they would not close for others. Fevers that he should not have survived. A mind that held more than its own. But he insisted he had not become immortal. He aged. He suffered. He diminished. Not at the normal rate, but stretched thin over a longer span. And he began, as he claimed, to absorb more than his own days. When someone died and there was no one to tell the story, when a name would vanish into a ledger marked sold or died, sometimes a trace migrated into him. In those years, he explained, his memory swelled with voices not originally his, and with each such accumulation, he believed he was granted, in some vague exchange, time enough to keep living. Whether Sutton believed the mechanism mattered less than what followed, the discovery of the journals. Samuel Pritchard had seen them, he said, tucked in a trunk in the corner of the cabin, 63 volumes, some bound, some stitched, some pages scavenged from whatever paper could be had. Caesar, when asked, admitted 3 hands had written them. "Mine," he said. "Mine as it was 50 years ago. Mine as it was 20 years ago. Mine as it is now." The letters change as age takes my fingers, but the words are constant. He had kept dates, names, small particulars. He wrote because slaves could not safely write their own stories, and white chroniclers seldom told the truth. He wrote because the woman Amarachi had told him to carry the weight. When Dr. Sutton and Fletcher opened the earliest volume, they found entries dated to 1795, penned in an elegant hand not expected of a man who had been denied schooling. The script matched the style taught in late 18th century primers. The phrasing on the page was deliberate and precise. Caesar explained he had stolen a primer from the son of his master and taught himself, scraping a private education in secret. It took years, he said. 3 years before I could make proper letters. But once you can read and write, they can take everything else from you. They cannot take your thoughts. The content of the books altered the investigation from curiosity to moral urgency. They were not the ruminations of a solitary eccentric. Instead, the journals read like a communal ledger. Dates, names, the careful accounting of lives suspended in brutality. One entry recorded Lydia, separated from her children and assigned to the master's house, her dignity intact, though every day demanded its erasure. Another entry, dated November 3, 1847, described, with the clinical coldness of an eyewitness account, the hold of a ship packed with bodies, chains biting memory into flesh. This is not my memory, the hand confessed in a later volume. I carry it now. Sutton read and reread passages aloud in the dim. The doctor, trained to map symptoms onto disease, found himself mapping names onto nights, dates onto places he could verify in other records. Fletcher cross-checked the entries against newspapers and county rolls. The matches, where they could be found, were precise. Where records had been lost to rot or fire, older residents' whispers supplied corroboration. The more they read, the less these were idle stories and more a repository, a litany of detail that belonged to no single man and to all of them. When Caesar described, in a page dated June 12, 1803, the way Lydia's youngest clung to her skirts, the way the oldest tried to run and was beaten, the detail was small and exact enough to be unbearable. It was the kind of specificity that belongs to witnesses, not inventors. And scattered through the later volumes were those ship memories, images of holds and prayers in languages unknown to Xenia, passages that suggested the memory of an experience never lived, but carried as if smelt and felt in bone. Sutton closed one book and spoke in a voice that betrayed more wonder than he had ever allowed himself in a lecture hall. If these are not forgeries, he said, then we are facing a phenomenon that does not fit any model of human experience I know. Fletcher's pencil tapped faster, notating the sentence that would later become a part of his own record. Caesar, pale and steady in the chair that had been his throne and his confessional, simply said, I record them because someone must remember. If I am the vessel, then let the vessel be used to keep their names from being lost. When Caesar identified the people described in those letters, naming them as easily as one recalls a neighbor's face, the cabin seemed to exhale. The old man was not inventing. He was remembering. The following evening, while the last light drained away outside, Dr. Sutton posed the question he had been swallowing for months. Caesar, he said, keeping his voice level, do you believe you physically lived 126 years? The old man regarded him with those watery, unnervingly lucid eyes. I believe I existed for that span, he said slowly. But lived? That is something else. I have had stretches, periods enclosed by human feeling. But most of my years were spent carrying memory, not living it. And how is it possible? Fletcher pressed. Caesar's gaze drifted toward the cabin's single window, where dusk lay pressed against the glass. There was a woman, he said finally. Her name was Amarachi. The room tightened as though it had a pulse. She carried knowledge across the ocean, Caesar continued. Real knowledge, the kind that can't be written down, only passed from breath to breath. She saw in me a fragile vessel. She feared the stories would vanish, so she bound them to me. Sutton, the man of science, wanted a clearer answer, a mechanism. Words like transfer, mnemonic transference, collective imprint skittered through his mind like frightened animals. But Caesar shook his head. You want to know how, he whispered. But perhaps the better question is why. He coughed, a thin, rattling sound, then pressed on. I carried the stories because they deserved to live. The world wanted silence. Amarachi answered with memory. Fletcher's pencil scratched the page, his face drawn tight. The moment felt less like an interview and more like listening to something unburied. In the days that followed, the journals became their central preoccupation. Sutton examined the older volumes with increasing reverence, tracing the strokes of letters written when the man who penned them would have been in his 20s, yet already writing as if he had lived multiple lifetimes. Fletcher organized the journals into rough chronology, cross-referencing names with county records, plantation sales, and obituaries printed in small, dying newspapers. The matches were too numerous to ignore. Names Caesar claimed to have known could be found in dusty ledgers. Out-of-the-way plantations he described were real. Prices listed in sale entries matched the years. Storms, droughts, epidemics, all recorded with a precision that seemed impossible for any single life to encompass. It was Sutton who noticed something quieter and more disturbing in the later volumes. Beginning in the 1840s, Caesar began to label certain memories explicitly as not his. I remember a ship, one entry read, but I have never set foot on one. Yet the memory stings as if I were there. Another, a man named Joshua was whipped for reading. I recall his pain more clearly than my own. Caesar watched the doctor read these lines. When Sutton finally looked up, shaken despite himself, Caesar asked almost gently, "Do you believe me mad?" Sutton, who had seen madness often enough to know its texture, answered slowly. "No," he said. "I believe you experienced something outside our understanding." Caesar nodded as if this was the only honest answer a man could give. As April warmed the earth, something in Caesar began to fray. His voice wavered between clarity and disorientation. His eyes sometimes seemed to follow figures no one else could see. Once, while Sutton adjusted his blankets, Caesar flinched violently, not from pain, but from recognition. "Who is here?" Sutton whispered. "All of them," Caesar breathed. And Sutton wrote later that though he saw nothing, he felt, for the first time in his life, that he was not alone in the room. By early May, Caesar's transformation became physical. Martha Hewitt noticed first. The translucence of his skin, the graying of eyes that had once held the color of creek water. Sutton confirmed it with professional dread. Caesar was shrinking, not wasting, but diminishing, as if some internal tension were relaxing after decades of being pulled too tight. "How do you feel?" the doctor asked. "Hollow," Caesar answered, "as if something is moving through me. Not out of malice, more like a duty being completed." Then, one morning, Sutton arrived to find Caesar in a state that nearly froze him in place. The old man was rigid in his chair, breath stuttering, eyes dilated. "They're here," he whispered. "Who?" Sutton pressed. The ones I carried. From that moment, the unraveling began. Voices poured from Caesar, not all at once, but in waves. High, low, old, young. Accents from places neither man had ever visited. At times he spoke as a child, at other moments as an elder whose grief had calcified. He flinched at invisible touches, answered unheard questions, mourned losses centuries old. Fletcher described it as watching identity melt and reform again and again, like wax held too close to flame. And still, Caesar insisted he was not dying. Not yet. I am being unmade, he whispered, so they can be released. For 3 full days, Sutton documented every shift, every voice, every detail of memories that belonged to people who had long since turned to soil. He wrote until his hands cramped and his ink froze at the nib, because he felt, though he would never say it aloud, that something sacred and terrible was passing through that room. On May 6th, Caesar surfaced again into clarity, like a man rising from beneath deep, dark water. He looked at the doctor and the reporter and apologized. "I should not have let you witness this," he said. "It is the breaking of a vessel." "Tell us what's happening," Fletcher urged, and Caesar did. "When the woman bound the memories to me, she did not mean for the burden to last this long, but it did. And every life I ever touched, every life that needed witness, attached itself to me. I lived long because I carried them, and now they are returning to whatever waits for them beyond memory. It is cleansing, and it is dissolution." Sutton asked, because he had to. "Is it painful?" "No," Caesar said. "It is not pain. It is surrender." For a quiet hour, the 3 men sat together in the fading afternoon light, one listening to the rattle of his own dwindling breath, the other 2 listening to the slow unwinding of a life that had stretched too far, too long. And then the clarity slid away again. By the evening of May 7th, the voices returned in languages none of them knew. The cabin filled with chants that rose and fell like tides, harmonies that should not have been possible from a single throat. Martha, trembling in the doorway, whispered, "That is not human." Sutton did not contradict her, and then, as if satisfied, the voices fell silent. The next night, May 8th, was the night the boundary between the natural and the impossible thinned to a filament. Fletcher, Sutton, and Pritchard ran through the darkness toward the cabin after hearing screams. Inside, every lamp burned as though begging for witness. Caesar stood upright, impossibly, arms outstretched, speaking in multiple voices at once. The sound shook the boards under their feet. None of the men touched him. They felt in their bones that to interrupt would be to trespass against something ancient. And just as suddenly, it ended. Silence, a flicker of lamps. Caesar sinking slowly back into himself. "I understand now," he said softly. "I was never meant to live a long life. I was meant to carry the ones who didn't." He looked at each man, and now I can let them go. The weight lifted, the borrowed years receded, and Caesar, in the smallest, gentlest voice they had ever heard from him, said, "It is finally time for me to die." He would linger 7 more days, peaceful now, his humanity restored to him as the voices departed. And the end of his witness was just beginning.